It's easy to make an image feel dark. Just turn down the exposure. The issue now is that we can't really see. To convey a darker scenario, it can actually be more about contrast and how much of the frame is made up of highlights and shadows. If you already know how to use a light meter to measure for ratios, skip ahead to this time. Contrast ratios are determined by measuring light with a light meter, and we measure light in f-stops or t-stops. We generally measure the amount of light falling onto the face from both our fill light and key light to determine the ratio. But how do we get a ratio from these numbers? Much like the stops on a camera lens, each full stop indicates a decrease or increase of light. With each higher number on a lens, there's a halving of light from the previous stop. And with each lower number, there's a doubling of light from the previous stop. But when measuring light in stops, a higher number means more light is hitting the face, as we would need to close down our lens's aperture to a higher stop to expose for it. And a lower number means less light is hitting the face, as we would need to open up our lens's aperture to a lower stop to expose for it. But in this case, we're not measuring to achieve a correct exposure, which can be decided separately. We're measuring to figure out the difference between key and fill. And there's only a one-stop difference between T2 and T2.8. Since each stop is either double or half of the previous, we can now understand that the key light is producing double the amount of light on the face as the fill. This means we have a 2:1 contrast ratio, with the 2 representing the key and the 1 representing the fill. Turn down the fill and measure again. Now we have a 2-stop difference, making it a 4:1 ratio. Since each stop represents double the light, we have, in total, a key side that is 4 times brighter than the fill side. And, as you may expect from this pattern, turning our fill light down to get 1 stop less again, and measuring to confirm, we now have a 3-stop difference between our key and fill. From fill to key, we've doubled our light once, twice, 3 times, making our key light 8 times brighter than our fill, which gives us an 8:1 contrast ratio. So by measuring contrast ratios, we can better utilize a higher ratio for a darker or low-key scene. The thing is, do we even need to measure contrast ratios on the face for a low-key image? We could, for example, close the curtains in this room and use this small window of daylight in the background to motivate our lighting. We used a PavoSlim 240C to do this, softbox and grid attached, angled at our subject in an upstage position. And since our softbox is gridded and pointed away from the background, we're able to keep most of the room and background essentially pitch black, achieving a large contrast, not just between the window and room, but also the lit and shadow side of the face. Even though we have some lighter elements in the shot, the majority of the frame is dark, so we would generally class this as a low-key image. It definitely gets across a darker mood and situation, with our character sat in a dark room, with a very small amount of daylight coming from the background. Curtains closed, 1 gridded softbox, low-key, easy. But what if we think this look is a bit too extreme? Maybe we want our character in a dark room, but we want to see some of that room. Instead of just blasting more light at our subject and the room loosely, leaving us to try and figure out how to balance it all to keep a dark feeling, we could, instead, add some fill light to the face and think about our contrast ratios. We set up a large bleached muslin backdrop close to our camera with an FC120C attached to a 60cm octabox fired into it. A measurement of our key puts it at T3.6, which is closest to a full stop of T4, and a measurement of our fill puts it at T2. That's around a 2-stop difference, or a 4:1 contrast ratio. It's relatively contrasty, but we'd like to take this down a stop further, into an 8:1 ratio, like we saw earlier. So we'll reduce our fill, and measure our ratios. Again, T3.6 on the key, which will round up to T4, and on our fill side, T1.4. About a 3-stop difference, or an 8:1 ratio. We have some visibility on the face and in the room, as opposed to before, where everything was in near total darkness. By measuring our ratios, we better understand the choice we have with our creative intent, and how to use lighting to achieve it. Both options are low-key, containing less highlights than shadows, but one gives us a little more detail, while still being a dark scene, and we can confirm these luminance values with exposure tools like a waveform, or even false colour. And now that we're happy with the ratio on the face, we could even use a tool like false colour a little more roughly to add some more light into our background, if needed. Here we used an FC120C, 90cm rapid softbox attached, aimed toward the back of the room, and turned on. We're able to fill our background with more light, but this is a little much. With false colour, we can see the light on the back wall is brighter than the predominant shadows in the shot, and it doesn't make sense for the back walls to be this light in comparison to the rest of the room. So we'll turn our background light down until it better matches the values of the rest of the room. Now the whole shot retains its low-key look, our subject outlined by the light from the back window, with both a high contrast ratio on the face and a darker room in general. This allows us to still see details in the shot, while at the same time visually conveying a dark room. All options are valid for a low-key look, but understanding how to measure for ratios and how to read our exposure tools allows us to better finesse our dark feeling image, creating more subtle looks which may better line up with our intent for the scene. We're much less likely to get confused about how much light we should be using in our shadows for a low-key image if we determine a contrast ratio. Here, we wanted our character looking out of the window into the garden at night. But to start with, it looked like this. So what we'd like to do is aim for an 8:1 contrast ratio once again. We had a lampshade in the background, a Pavobulb 10C inside, set to around 3200 Kelvin. Second, our key. This was an FC120C reflector dish attached, bounced into a small length of bleached muslin material, also set to 3200 Kelvin, motivated by the background lampshade. To keep this light from affecting the background, we hung a length of dark material between the bounce and the rest of the room. But currently, it's not doing as much as we'd like it to, since our light is a bit too bright. And our third light, the cool nighttime sky, is also too bright. This was another FC120C, set to a cool blue tone using the RGB mode, bounced into a 6x6 frame of bleached muslin above the window. Let's turn our key light down, and turn our fill light off. Now we have far less light spilling in the background, and the exposure level on the face is more in line with where we want it, allowing our image to consist of a much smaller percentage of highlights to shadows. So let's measure the key. T2.5. That's closest to a full stop of T2.8. Now let's turn our cool nighttime fill back on, adjust it by eye, and measure it. T 1.4, a 2-stop difference, and around a 4:1 contrast ratio. This could easily be used for something more stylistic, but we want it to be a little more subtle here, so we'll turn down our fill a little more, and measure again. T 1.1. Close enough to T1 for us to round it down. That's a 3-stop difference, giving us about an 8:1 contrast ratio. And finally, we added a window reflection in post-production. The difference doesn't seem big on the surface. As opposed to earlier, we're now working with more saturated colours, which are already creating a contrast of their own. So a 4:1 might be the better option depending on the intent of the image. But we'd like to keep things more subtle, to flow better into the following nighttime shot, creating a cohesive feeling of night overall. So understanding the ratios here worked in our favour. It's worth noting that we primarily looked at the usefulness of tying together high contrast ratios in low-key scenes, but it's also possible to use smaller contrast ratios in low-key scenes, depending on the look and feeling you're going for in an image. And we don't necessarily have to measure for ratios every time we light an image, but it could be a big help in being able to visualize the right mood for the scene, and how you expose the rest of your location, as well as allowing you to repeat ratios across different shots within the same scene reliably, or even for reshoots. Working with contrast ratios and low-key images are just another 2 aspects of lighting for cinema. Extended episodes of Lighting for Cinema are released early on Patreon and to YouTube members, with patrons getting extra videos and access to the Discord server.